As we pick up with the book of Leviticus, the narrative that has been flowing so quickly, remember how quickly Genesis flowed? 11 chapters covers half of biblical history, and then even the generations of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob move very quickly. And when we come to the book of Exodus, the story continues early on to move very quickly, all the way up until they come to Mount Sinai. And then, once they come to Mount Sinai, we see the story slow down as God instructs his people about how they're going to serve him and relate to him. Now remember, the book of Leviticus picks up right where the book of Exodus leaves off. In the book of Exodus, God had taken his chosen nation and made a covenant with them. And that covenant had a series of laws that explained how they would serve him and how they would honor him and his presence among them. When we come to the book of Leviticus, it continues the guidelines, the requirements that God gives his people. You can see that the key idea for the book of Leviticus is, how does a chosen nation serve a holy God? When we consider the book of Leviticus, if we were just to read through it very quickly, we would discover the term for holy is found 87 times in this book. It is the central idea. It starts with the great holiness and absolute holiness of God and extends down to his people. This is why God says, "As I am holy, be holy." When we consider how the book then is put together, we open the book and we see there's a whole series of statements, of laws about sacrifices and priests. So it guides the people about how to bring a sacrifice, what the priest's role is to be, just to ensure that the sacrifice is done properly. Secondly, then, we see a section about personal holiness. It's about hygiene and cleanliness. It really was designed to set the children of Israel apart from the nations that were around them. You see, many of the nations that surrounded them used bodily fluids as a part of their worship. They drank blood and urine and other bodily fluids as an aspect of their worship. And so many of these personal hygiene practices were designed to separate the children of Israel to God so that they would truly be holy among the nations. You'll notice we're skipping a section, but we'll come back to it. He continues on with their personal holiness, again describing how they in their daily lives can walk with the Lord, be holy, and reflect God's holiness. In chapters 23 to 25, then, we see a series of guidelines about the great feasts and how God is to be worshiped. So here we learn about those amazing festivals that drew the people back to Jerusalem, back to God's presence, and there they worshiped and honored him. The book ends with a focus on reverencing the Lord. It's no surprise in a book that 87 times reminds us of the holiness of God that it ends with he is a God to be reverenced. Now, what's the center part that I left out? This is the centerpiece of the book, the Day of Atonement. This is the one day that the children of Israel gathered and had the sins of their nation forgiven. Really, all of the book of Leviticus wraps around this. How do we have reverence for God? Well, we're holy through forgiven sin. How do we properly have personal holiness? Well, it has to start with a clean heart. And so the Day of Atonement, it centers the whole book of Leviticus. So let's take a look and just spend a moment thinking about the Day of Atonement. I want you to see in these two chapters three very important themes that come from this section and are important to the whole book of Leviticus. The first one is there's one sacrifice. Now, there were a lot of sacrifices described in Leviticus, but if you read those carefully, Those were for sins of mistake. Those were not sins that were intentional. They were unintentional. And so those were ongoing sins, and they were individual. But when it came down to one blanket sacrifice that took away the sin of all of the people, that took it away for the whole year, there was one sacrifice, and that came on the Day of Atonement. Also, in these 2 chapters, it teaches the people of God there's only one altar. When people came to bring their sacrifices, or they came and gathered for the Day of Atonement, they gathered in front of the tabernacle. The presence of God was where the altar was made. They entered into his presence through the sacrifice made on that one altar. They could not go and do things at home. They could not do it out in the field. It wasn't like the nations were around them, where there were lots of high places and lots of sacred groves and trees where they could sacrifice. No, there was one central place where God required them to bring their sacrifice. Also, in the instructions about the Day of Atonement, they were very, very detailed about how the priest was to prepare and how they were to prepare the sacrifice, and how the one time in the year that the priest could enter into the Holy of Holies and place the blood of the sacrifice on the mercy seat. They're on the place where they were reminded of the very presence of God on the Ark of the Covenant. There, that one way, that's how sacrifice was made. Now, we can't leave the book of Leviticus as Christians without thinking about Christ. Just think of these 3 themes, these 3 requirements about the Day of Atonement, and how significant they are for our faith. There's one sacrifice. The book of Hebrews reminds us that the shed blood of bulls and goats took nobody's sin away, ultimately. Only Christ, the single and final sacrifice, takes our sin away. Also, there's only one place, only one altar. When Christ came, he came to Jerusalem. He came to the place where people were used to coming, the one place to give sacrifice. There he taught. There he confronted the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. But there also, he gave the one final sacrifice. We also learn again from the book of Hebrews that when Christ gave his sacrifice, it was more than just being in Jerusalem. He entered into the true Holy of Holies in heaven and gave himself for our sake. Finally, that sacrifice is made only one way. We live in a world and minister to people who often try to find lots of ways to be redeemed, lots of ways to be forgiven, who try to find lots of gods. But the scripture makes it very clear. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. One sacrifice, one altar, one way. That was true for the children of Israel and for Christians in a much greater way. The one way we see the Father, through Jesus Christ.